This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by the Seeker's Guide to Twisted Taverns, which is a new product for 5th edition, live on Kickstarter till March 6th.
The Seeker's Guide to Twisted Tavern includes 14 new tavern locations filled with crazy NPCs, exciting clues and mysteries to explore, as well as just a lot of fun and games and revelry to improve your games of Dungeons & Dragons.
Taverns have been a cornerstone of Dungeons & Dragons campaign, and I feel like we're overdue for a good pub crawl.
Some of our amazing friends are working on this project, including Logan from Runesmith here on YouTube, as well as Eldermancy and Ghostfire Games. So please check out the Kickstarter and see all the great stuff they're working on.
They have totally blown past all their funding goals and are adding on some amazing new features to the book as we speak. So check them out right at Kickstarter by following the links below.
And now, onto this week's episode.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
This is part 2 of our subclass tier ranking guide to the Sorcerer in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. In part 1, the previous video, we covered the 2 subclasses available to Sorcerers in the Player's Handbook, and today, in part 2, we are covering the 3 subclasses that were introduced in Xanathar's Guide to Everything: the Divine Soul, the Shadow Magic Sorcerer, and the Storm Sorcerer. In part 3 of this guide, we will be looking at the new subclasses that were introduced in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything.
If you look on the screen right now, you'll see the criteria that we use to rank the subclasses. We have pitted the subclasses against each other and not those of other classes. Also, the flavor of the class and its role-playing aspect are not necessarily taken into account, as we believe that anybody can roleplay a sorcerer wonderfully. Also, we might touch on some multi-class and combinations, but they are not a core mechanic that we are looking at for our grading system.
As with all our tier ranking videos, we consider all elements of Dungeons & Dragons gameplay when we rank these subclasses. It is not just combat capabilities that we are looking at here. We're also considering how well does the subclass give the Sorcerer base class new options for problem solving, overcoming exploration scenarios, and even convincing non-player characters in social interaction scenarios where you need to use your sorceress might to convince an NPC to follow along with your suggested course of action.
So let's take a look at these 3 sorcerer subclasses. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
Kicking things off, we have the Divine Soul Sorcerer. The spark of magic can come from many places, and there is no greater wellspring of magic and supernatural forces in the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons than the gods themselves. And there are many gods that are associated with arcane forces, and some that are not. And sometimes their pregnancy may carry the spark of divine and arcane magic in a strange blend, birthing a Divine Soul Sorcerer.
Right away at first level, you gain the feature that anybody playing a Divine Soul Sorcerer is here for, and that is Divine Magic. Right away at first level, you gain access to the entire Cleric spell list, and you gain 1 additional bonus spell based on your alignment. You are still limited to the number of spells known on the Sorcerer table, but when you're trading out your spells or choosing new spells, you now have access to either list.
Also at first level, you are favored by the gods. When you fail a saving throw or miss with an attack roll, you can immediately choose to roll 2d4 and add the result to the total, possibly changing the result from a failed saving throw to a successful one, or a miss into a hit. You can use this ability once, and then it recharges on a short or long rest.
At 6th level, you gain Empowered Healing. If you or an ally within 5 feet of you get to roll dice to regain hit points from a healing spell that has been cast, you can use a sorcery point to re-roll any number of those dice that you want.
At level 14, you sprout wings. They could be bat wings or angel wings, depending on your alignment or in your divine affinity. These give you a flying speed of 30 feet. Take to the skies.
At 18th level, you gain Unearthly Recovery. If you are at half your hit points or lower, you can use a bonus action to regain half of your total hit points. Pretty great healing option.
So as we look at the combined package of the Divine Soul, flight's cool, healing yourself is cool, getting extra rolls to your saving throws and attack rolls is cool. the empowered healing thing is cool. If that was all the subclass was, it would be super meh. But that's not all the subclass is. It adds the entire cleric spell list to your options as a sorcerer. And that is insanely potent, because now you are opening up the entire cleric spell list to interact with the sorcerer's meta magic feature. And terrible and amazing things can happen when you can extend, twin, and quicken some of the greatest hits from the cleric spell list. Spells such as Aid, which is great to extend. Adding the arsenal of Spiritual Weapon and Spirit Guardians to your options. And all sorts of other great spells, like maybe, how about twinning Raise Dead? You can even do really, really simple things, like have the ability to twin Healing Word. It means that you have a wicked character building problem, because balancing how many spells you're going to take from the cleric spell list with how many spells you're going to take from the sorcerer spell list is really, really, really hard. So I believe that this is one of the most powerful sorcerer subclasses, possibly one of the best. Certainly the best before Tasha's Cauldron of Everything came out. Yeah. It is an S tier subclass, but it is by far and away the hardest one to play, because there is such a difficult choice to make with how you choose the spells. It is really easy to over specialize and spread your character thin and play this Divine Soul by, I'm going to load up with Cure Wounds and and take all the healing spells, and that is a mistake.
Yeah, when we look at the cleric spell list, something that you and I have talked a lot about is that the cleric spell list is underrated for also being one of the greatest spell lists for battlefield control and damage dealing. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of awesome spells on this list. And so a lot of people, when they think of the cleric spell list, they think of healing. But healing to me is actually second or third rank on what I care about in the cleric spell list. When we look at combining a sorcerer and cleric spell list together, what I hear is I get to be even more blasty. I get to have some of the greatest spells. Being able to have a spiritual weapon and spirit guardians on a sorcerer is so great. And really, at the end of the day, if I take those two and a couple other of my choice picks, and then the rest are from the sorcerer spell list, I'm a happy camper.
Yeah, just being able to take Toll the Dead, spiritual weapon, spirit guardians, and then start flying around with your wings and tossing fireballs and strategically moving so that your spirit guardians are doing lots of great damage and doing all this great stuff, you will be very, very happy, and it's very, very powerful. The mistake that you can run into is trying to get the most mileage out of the empowered healing ability, which with the Divine Soul sorcerers that I've played and seen played, like when this ability comes up, it's like, cool, but you don't build the character around it.
No, but something that we should take into account is even beyond the spell list, which is the clear reason why this subclass gets ranked really, really high. But if you look at the package of abilities that they have, yeah, like you said, they're not the greatest in the world, but they're all good. They're all useful. Being able to fly is always a great option. And I say this every time it comes up, but giving a subclass an ability that just says, you now get to fly, is great. And having these kind of bonuses to the aspects of healing, even your top level ability to just be like, I need half my hit points back. Bam, it's there. These are all really useful and complement the play style that the Divine Soul is advertising. They complement it really well. Yeah. And really that, if you take that package and add on top of it the fact that you and I both know the power that is hidden inside of the cleric spell list, it's got to be S tier. Yeah,
and one of the things that really came to my mind recently is we recently did our video on sorcerer spells. And one of the things that both you and I had when we were picking our 6th, 7th, and 8th, especially level spells for the sorcerer, was the choices were kind of lukewarm. But then I thought back to that video that we did on high-level cleric spells. And how when we looked at things like Divine Word and Holy Aura and Temple of the Gods and Resurrection and Heal and The actual amazingness of this is what happens to the sorcerer at higher levels when you can access those high-level cleric spells and do crazy meta magic to them.
What actually happens is, we've talked about the fact that sorcerers, they kind of peak at about level 10. And then their spell selection starts to taper off. You don't really have that many great spells to choose from. You might take Incinerary Cloud or something, but it's not that amazing. But by adding the cleric spell list to this, you're actually giving the sorcerer better longevity in longer campaigns. Again, not a lot of campaigns go past 15th level, but if you are, the Divine Soul is going to stay important for that whole ride. Divine Soul lands in an S tier for us. It's interesting because the Tasha subclasses both do very interesting things that we'll talk about in another video, but pre-Tasha's, this was definitely the best of the best. And still, I think, stands up as one of the best options for sorcerers.
All right, Sebastian Crow, tell us about your Shadow Sorcerer.
As we come to the Shadow Sorcerer, these sorcerers draw their magic from the Shadowfell. They might be associated with something like the Raven Queen or other entities of the Shadowfell. They use this dark energy to fuel their magical powers.
In other words, you're a brooding misanthrope who was born on Halloween and might have parental issues.
Leave my backstory out of this.
At first level, you gain the Eyes of the Dark ability. You have dark vision to a range of 120 feet, and at third level, you automatically learn the Darkness spell. You can cast the Darkness spell using 2 sorcery points instead of a spell slot, and when you do, you can see in the magical darkness of your Darkness spell.
Also, at first level, you gain Strength of the Grave. If you're reduced to 0 hit points, you get to make a Charisma saving throw to see if instead you drop to 1 hit point.
That would have been a really cool ability to remember that you had.
Yeah, too bad I forgot it every time.
At level 6, you gain the ability to summon the Hound of Ill Omen using 3 sorcery points. The Hound of Ill Omen has the statistics of a modified direwolf, and you sick it on one of your enemies. Once you summon the Hound of Ill Omen, which takes a bonus action to do, that hound goes after that target. And thereafter, if the hound is within 5 feet of the target and you cast a spell against them, the target has disadvantage on their saving throws against the spell. The hound disappears after 5 minutes, or if itself or the target are reduced to 0 hit points.
At 14th level, you gain Shadow Walk. If you're in an area of dim light or darkness, you can teleport up to 120 feet to another area of dim light or darkness.
At level 18, you gain the ability to take on a shadowy form as an action by spending 6 sorcery points. For 1 minute after you adopt this form, you have resistance to all damage except for force and radiant damage, and you can walk through creatures and objects as if they weren't there, but you do take damage if you end your turn inside an object.
So looking at the Shadow Sorcerer, obviously I am going to say many good things about this because I have played one for a long-term campaign that is probably my favorite character I've ever played. That being said, there's a lot of good stuff here. And I really like the sort of atmosphere that this creates, but also the abilities that it uses to feed in to that whole vibe of the Shadow Sorcerer. I think, skipping right to the Hound of Ill Omen, this is my favorite ability that this class gets. It's extremely useful. You get to have a shadowy pet that you can summon. It can move through walls, it can find its target, it seeks them out, and then it also not only helps you attack them and gives you a way to block them from getting to you because now they're tied up in combat, but also you now get to cast spells on your target and they get disadvantage on the saving throws. So if you're taking a lot of great spells that are single target and require a saving throw, pairing that with the Hound of Ill Omen is a winning situation. I think that the ability to cast Darkness with 2 sorcery points and seeing in it is giving the Shadow Sorcerer the keys to something that we know the Warlock can do, and a lot of people have advertised as one of the most killer Warlock abilities, but now you're saying, hey, for a couple sorcery points, you can do it too. And if you pair a Shadow Sorcerer and a Warlock together with Darkness, oh boy. So the Shadow Sorcerer has these ways of interacting with darkness and elements of darkness that are actually really meaningful and change the game. The ability to teleport is extremely useful at later levels, and I just find everything that's kind of going on here feeds into the shadowy theme while giving you a lot of opportunities to play around with these options during the game. The Shadow Sorcerer doesn't give you a lot outside of combat-oriented abilities, but most of the Sorcerer subclasses offer similar packages. Even though this might not be the best Sorcerer subclass, it is probably one of my favorites, and I really am enjoying playing it, and I have enjoyed playing it long term, and I think it's safe to give this an A ranking. I think that it stands up above a lot of the other options and stands out as a winning combination that if you are into the theme of what the Shadow Sorcerer offers, you're going to have a great time and all the abilities play really well.
The Hound of Ill-Omen is amazing. It imposes disadvantage on all saving throws against spells you cast against the target. This can mean that you can do amazing things like lock somebody in place with hold person or hold monster while your Hound rips them to shreds, scoring automatic critical hits because they're paralyzed. You can cast Darkness on yourself with sorcery points, start firing lasers out of it with advantage. Or you can sick the Hound on someone, lock them in place with a spell, and have the Hound eat them. And then you can do all your other fun sorcerer stuff. You got to remember that you have Strength of the Grave, and you can come back with 1 hit point. The biggest challenge, actually, with the Shadow Sorcerer is not relying on darkness all the time, and having things to do with your sorcery points that aren't casting darkness or summoning the Hound of Ill-Omen. Because the Hound of Ill-Omen is 3 sorcery points, and casting the darkness is 2. So if you do once of those each during an adventuring day, that's 5 sorcery points, which at level 6, when you get the Hound of Ill-Omen, is almost all of your sorcery points. So you really want to take a metamagic like subtle spell with the Shadow Sorcerer, and it makes it actually quite difficult for you to take metamagic like Twin Spell, which are quite costly, and also Twin Spell doesn't really benefit from the Hound of Ill-Omen because the Hound is sicked on a single target. So there's some interesting kind of build considerations that you want to do with the Shadow Sorcerer that twist some of the traditional logic of taking metamagic and taking spells with a sorcerer on its head, which I think is to its benefit. But again, you're not always going to be able to apply conventional sorcerer logic to the Shadow Sorcerer and get ideal results. I completely agree with you though, Kelly. This is an A subclass. Probably an A+.
Yeah, I do think, though, that when you talk about that 1-2 punch, it's something that I used endlessly, is depending on the combat encounter, either hiding in darkness and using something like Scorching Ray, where now you have advantage on all of your shots because you're in darkness and they can't see you, but you can see them. And then if you're in a situation where there's one target that needs to die, and you're going to cast something like Mental Prison or Banishment or some of these single target high level spells that require a saving throw, sicking your Hound on that target and just ending that encounter. Pretty sure I took out a Beholder with the combination of the Hound of Ill-Omen and Hold Monster.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'll say is that this is where you run into weird traps with the Shadow Sorcerer, because sicking your Hound of Ill-Omen on a target that you're going to cast Banishment on now prevents you from getting the full value of the multiple instances of disadvantage that you get from the Hound of Ill-Omen. You really want to have Hold Monster instead of Banishment in that case, because the big benefit of the Hound of Ill-Omen is that you can continue to get disadvantage from that target as the Hound eats them.
Yeah, there is a lot of consideration that I think needs to go into how your spell selection plays with your abilities with darkness and your abilities with the Hound of Ill-Omen. You need to take that into account as well as your metamagic options. Mm-hmm. I did take Quicken Spell and Twin Spell, but I actually have found it hard to use those because really I'm relying more on Empowered Spell, and I really should have taken Subtle Spell because they are more in line with using my sorcery points for the Shadow Sorcerer abilities rather than the other options. Although I still think you should pack Twin Spell because Twinned Haste. So yeah. I do think that what this is doing is you need to be more careful about how you use your sorcery points, but it's giving you a very versatile list of options for how to interact with each combat encounter. And you can usually find a way to thwart your enemies using something that the Shadow Sorcerer has given you.
The other downside of the Hound of Ill Omen is that it is very combat oriented, because the only thing that it can do is you have to sick it on a target. You can't just summon it. It has to be pointed at something, and the only thing that it can do to that target is try to kill it. We never actually tried this in our campaign, but could you summon the Hound of Ill Omen beside somebody, have it growl at them while you cast Suggestion on them, and not have the Hound eat them? Or does the Hound always have to attack somebody? I don't know. That actually never came up in our games, but that's an interesting question if you can use it in that non-combat way, but you always have to be using it against a target. All right, so it's time to bring the thunder and the wrath of the storm. The Storm Sorcerer is here to rock you like a hurricane.
Maybe.
How much the Storm Sorcerer actually rocks is a matter of taste, but they certainly will be rolling around the battlefield with their Tempestuous Magic class feature. Wow, that's hard to say. Starting at first level, they gain the ability that whenever they cast a sorcerer spell of first level or higher, they get to just zip 10 feet in flight before or after casting the spell without provoking opportunity attacks. So it's just a little hop, hop.
Also at first level, you gain Wind Speaker. You can have Speak, Read, and Write Primordial, and you can understand all of the other elemental speeches.
At level 6, you gain the Heart of the Storm class feature. You gain resistance to lightning and thunder damage, which is of dubious value for a player character because those damage types are very rare. In addition, whenever you cast a sorcerer spell of first level or higher that deals lightning or thunder damage, you send out a pulse of thunderous energy that deals damage equal to half your sorcerer level to everybody within 10 feet of you. You get to choose these creatures so it doesn't harm your allies. The bolts are smart enough. The thing to be aware of is that there's a pretty limited number of spells on the sorcerer spell list that will actually trigger this ability. This includes Chromatic Orb if you use it to do lightning damage, Witch Bolt, Thunder Wave, Shatter, Lightning Bolt, Thunderstep, Storm Sphere, and Chain Lightning. There's also a few other adaptable spells that might be able to deal some lightning damage, like Dragon Breath or possibly even Prismatic Spray if you roll the damage for lightning on it. But it's only a handful of spells that are available to sorcerers, and actually only a handful of spells in the entire game that deal lightning and thunder damage. So you better like those spells because you're taking them.
At 6th level, you gain the ability Storm Guide, which proves to be a mostly cosmetic ability. You can make it stop raining in a 20-foot area if it is raining. You can change the direction of the wind, but you cannot increase how fast or hard it's blowing. You can just change its direction. So you can subtly impact the weather. So I guess if you're on a seafaring campaign, this might actually be a really useful ability. But if you're not on a seafaring campaign, you might find something.
At level 14, you gain the Storm's Fury power. If you are hit by a melee attack, you can use your reaction to cause lightning damage to whoever hits you equal to your sorcerer level, and they have to make a strength saving throw or be punted 20 feet away from you.
At 18th level, you gain the ability Wind Soul. You now are immune to thunder and lightning damage, and you gain a flying speed of 60 feet. You can also choose to half that to 30 feet flying speed, and in exchange, you can give a number of creatures, up to 3 plus your charisma modifier, a flying speed of 30 feet as well.
I am not blown away by this subclass.
Nothing here really shocks me.
The first problem with the subclass is, as we mentioned earlier, there's like a handful of spells in D&D 5e that deal lightning and thunder damage. They're good spells. There's nothing wrong with taking them, but all of them? Like, you get a lot of overlap. Like, if you're going to have a character that is going to have Thunder Wave, you should never take Witch Bolt. Shatter, Lightning Bolt, Thunderstep, and Chain Lightning, that's 5 or 6 spells that all deal damage, and only one of them has like the teleport utility, which is awesome. So you can really load up on a lot of spells, and I find it disappointing that the subclass doesn't also bring in the other storm-themed spells like Gust of Wind, or Ice Storm, or Tidal Wave, or Watery Sphere. All the other cool spells that interact with the water side of the storm. So it doesn't really have the full suite of the storm abilities. It's just wind and lightning, and it kind of forgot to bring the rain.
I agree. I think that if we were to build a real Storm Sorcerer, there's a lot of other spells that actually feed into that sort of image. I think that they should just gain the ability to manipulate and change these spells in meaningful ways, instead of just adding a small spattering of extra damage occasionally on this tiny selection of spells. I think that the theme of a Storm Sorcerer is really cool, but there's not enough here to make up for the fact that your spell list for lightning and thunder spells is limited.
And the first ability that you gain from this class, which lets you zip 10 feet with flight every time you cast a spell, before or after, is actually really cool. It actually creates a lot of mobility, and I can see it being used really, really effectively in play. But I can't help but feel that because that triggers on every single spell that you cast, it is limiting everything else that the spell that this subclass is giving you. It's like, it feels like a 10-foot flying speed that essentially amounts to a hop is burdening down this class, because a 10-foot flying speed that only lasts that long, it's not like you're going to be able to keep away from your enemies with that. You're not going to fly up in the air where they can't get you. You're going to fly away, but then they're going to walk back up to you and still keep hitting you. And to get the extra damage, you also have to be really in close to them. And, you get that level 14 reaction ability to shock them and punt them away from you. But I mean, you had shield at first level to protect yourself. I think this is a C.
I'm willing to completely agree. I think that although I like the idea of a Storm Sorcerer, I could play a different Sorcerer subclass, take the Storm spells, and still feel like I'm playing out that sort of fantasy. Whereas this actually doesn't give me enough ways to meaningfully impact that sort of magic. And like when we look at something like the transmute spell ability that came out in Tasha's, if you decided to take something like Fireball with the idea that you are going to use transmute spell to change that, you would have gotten way more bang for your buck by using empowered spell, and it actually is a detriment if you think you're going to start transmuting all your spells to be lightning and thunder damage. The payoff isn't good enough here. And I think it was a big missed opportunity to not include ice and water spells as part of this package. And as we saw in Tasha's, there are extended spell lists that have been added in. If the Storm Sorcerer had granted us all of those spells we listed as part of the package, and had ways of moving damage around between, like, adding damage to thunder and lightning or adding a stun ability, I don't know. There's options out there to really make you feel like you're playing your Storm fantasy. But it just doesn't deliver on that, and for that, it's a C ranking.
Also, isn't it kind of a travesty that the Shadow Magic Sorcerer gets to teleport at level 14, the Divine Soul and the Dragon get to fly at level 14, and you as the Storm Sorcerer, the one who has flying as a theme, get this little piddly around 10-foot fly speed that you're kind of like hopping around with like a hummingbird, and you have to wait till level 18 to get your fly speed.
Yeah, but don't worry, all campaigns go to level 18, and you have all the time in the world to be whipping around flying.
Yeah, no. This subclass could have been way more bolder by giving you flight at level 1.
It feels like this subclass, although it's fun and people will have a great time playing it, it's why I don't think it deserves the D ranking. It doesn't take away from the Sorcerer. It adds some cool abilities. But when I look at it, and the main question that I ask of any subclass of any class is, does it advertise a fantasy and then deliver on that fantasy in a meaningful and impactful way? Yes, these abilities all have to do with storms, but in play, I don't feel like I'm the god of storms.
And here's a question. Let's say that a new D&D book comes out that adds a ton of spells that deal lightning and thunder damage. Would that rise the stock of this subclass?
To a B, maybe.
You know who else it would also rise the stock of? A blue dragon sorcerer.
So up on screen right now, you'll see the final rankings for the sorcerers that we have ranked so far. But let's take a look at what our community has to say about these three.
So the Divine Soul is a crowd pleaser, with just over 55% giving it an S tier ranking and about 30% giving it an A tier ranking, with 12.5% giving it a B and slivers of the C and D ranking. Overwhelmingly, the Divine Soul is the favored by the gods.
With our Shadow Magic Sorcerer, we are looking at just over 25% for S tier. We're sitting at 46, pushing 47% for A tier, 23% for B tier, and very little for C and D tier. Landing very, very prominently in the A tier, with an even split between people who liked it more or less than that. But I think it's safe to say that this is a strong subclass, and an A ranking seems very fitting for it.
Finally, the Storm Sorcerer received about 7.7% S tier rankings, 27% A tier rankings, and about 42% B tier rankings, with 18.2% giving it a C tier ranking. Overall, a little bit more positive reception of the Storm Sorcerer than what Kelly and I gave it. Overall, a solid B here, with a pretty sizable number of people feeling a lot better about the Storm Sorcerer than Kelly and I did.
A few of our comments about the Storm Sorcerer kind of pull into the idea that that ability to kind of hop around is actually really game-changing and very useful. And I do think it is the best feature that the Storm Sorcerer has going for it. Another great point that was brought up is that the Storm Sorcerer actually might make a great multi-class with something like the Tempest Domain Cleric, where you can actually feed more into that sort of stormy elements. And I do think that those are valid points. I do think it's interesting, though, that overall a lot of people seem to like the Storm Sorcerer a lot more than I ever will.
Although a few people did express disappointment that the Storm Sorcerer does not get spells like Call Lightning added to their spell list, and a few others mentioned that the Storm Sorcerer does encourage you to get in close to your enemies, which is not a place where a class with a D6 hit die wants to be.
So up on the screen right now, you will see our final rankings for the subclasses, and next to that, you will see the community rankings for the subclasses. There's a lot of overlap here. I think that we can agree that a lot of the Sorcerer subclasses offer some really interesting play styles for people who enjoy the Sorcerer class overall.
Kelly and I have finally had the opportunity to start playing some of the new subclasses introduced in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. So in the next couple of weeks with our future videos, you can expect us to start adding some part 3s to our subclass tier rankings, where we start looking at the new Sorcerer subclasses. We have lots of things to say about the Clockwork Soul, so stay tuned for that.
So this has been part 2 of our Sorcerer subclass tier rankings in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about your thoughts on the various Sorcerer subclasses in the comments below.
Kelly and I want to send a massive thank you to all of our Patreon supporters who make what we do here on YouTube possible. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via Patreon by following the links in the description below.
Also, our live campaign, Dungeons of Drakkenheim, is coming to Kickstarter. We have partnered with Ghostfire Games to bring Dungeons of Drakkenheim to life as a 5th edition module. You can follow the links below to join a mailing list so that you can be up to date on all the information involving this Kickstarter. We also play the campaign every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we have plenty more tier rankings for all the classes in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time
in the dungeon.